do not need to be a feminist or even female to pay tribute to the women's suffrage movement, because although the topic is on women's suffrage, the overall idea is about democracy. During America's early years as a country, women were being denied key rights that men were already enjoying. Rights such as the right to vote, the right to earn property, and women didn't even have the right over the money that they earned themselves. After researching this subject, I have a newfound respect for the women's suffrage movement and its leaders. If not for the women's suffrage movement, women may not have earned the right to vote until a much later time. So today we will discuss the women's suffrage movement, and we will then pay tribute to the movement's prime leaders. Finally, we will discuss the outcome of this movement and how it was obtained without any acts of violence. To begin, women were people, people are citizens, and citizens have the right to make political changes. These political changes are made through voting. Therefore, women should have the right to vote. Suffrage is the right to vote in public elections. Men were also suffragists. The women's suffrage movement depended on women and men alike. Men had to have the courage of a lion to be able to openly support the women's rights movement at that time, because in doing so, it subjected them to much ridicule and possibly even worse. Women vote today because of the women's suffrage movement, which was a critical, courageous, persistent political campaign that lasted over 70 years. Inspired by realism, the suffrage movement played a huge political and social significance, yet it was often left out of American history books. And if it was not left out so much by historians, then the movement's prime leaders would be just as recognizable to fellow Americans as other leaders of the past, such as Martin Luther King and Theodore Roosevelt. For many, many years, men and women have been fighting for these equal rights. They made speeches, they signed petitions, they marched in parades, and they argued over and over that women, like men, deserved all the rights and responsibilities that come with citizenship. You may have heard of her. Susan B. Anthony was one of the most well-known women's rights activists of her time. She firmly believed that men and women should live and work together as equals. Anthony was one of the first women to bring up women's issues into politics. She thought it was very important that women earn the right to vote so that their needs and issues were heard by the government. She was often mocked and ridiculed for her political campaigns and was rarely taken serious. But Susan B. Anthony remained steadfast like the tree that grew in the rapid river. Susan B. Anthony also helped found the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she continued to fight for women's rights and the woman right to vote until she died in 1906. Another one of the movement's honorable leaders was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was one of the leading activists of her time, leading activists and philosophers of her time. Susan believed that women had to fight for the equality of themselves before they could fight for the equality of others. It was her and activist Lucretia Mott who organized America's first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls in New York in 1848. It was here that over 250 men and women gathered to discuss the condition of women's rights in America. Men and women together signed a declaration that stated that women were equal citizens to men. This was a turning point for women's suffrage. Both of these women were very inspiring, courageous individuals who unfortunately passed before they were able to reap the benefits of their hard work. But if not for their tireless effort, the women's suffrage movement may never have gone into motion. If not for their determination and skill, women may not have earned the right to vote till a much later time. And if it was not for their refusal to quit, democracy might not be all that we know it to be today. For women won the right to vote. They were not given it. They won the right to vote just like many campaigns have been won and lost throughout history. Suffrage was first granted in California in 1911, and finally the last state, Tennessee, granted it in 1920 by one vote after a recount. and then ratified on August 18th in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution legally gave women the right to vote in America. The women's struggle for their voting went on for over 70 years, and yet no one was ever harmed for this cause. When compared to past male-led campaigns, you really understand the velocity and greatness of this achievement. It is very empowering to know that mountains can be moved despite your social status. Women were able to achieve what men have rarely even tried, which was achieve a better America without having harm fall on anyone. But many of the suffrage leaders were born pacifists, and their nonviolent strategies deserve our admiration, as these strategies often were the reason for dead ends in their movement and prolonged results. But these courageous women were all clear about their common goal, which was not victory over men, but equality for all. These were brave, fierce women, the first woman candidates, the first woman office holders. These are stories of immense achievement. And despite all that we have discussed, the women's suffrage movement is still often misrepresented in history books. This misrepresentation can be blamed for the misconceptions that the movement was nothing but a passive white upper-class naive controversy that was not worthy of our praise. However, if people could really have a look at the movement and these women, they would not see old meek women, but they would recognize supreme leaders, visionaries, and warriors. Women who came from many different backgrounds to push the envelope a little bit further than women ever had before. This movement teaches us today that women of all kinds can come together and make a difference. And although the ideal equality is still not yet there here in America, this movement and its leaders have left a solid ground and a solid foundation for new generations of activists to continue the fight.